Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The autumn of 2017 marked the beginning of something that would forever change how I viewed the wilderness. I was 17 then, caught in that peculiar space between childhood and adulthood, where adventure still called louder than caution. My parents had enrolled me in our school's outdoor education program, a 3-day camping expedition to Pine Ridge Mountain, about 4 hours north of our town. The morning of departure arrived crisp and clear. I remember standing in the school parking lot at 6 a.m., watching my breath form small clouds in the cold air while other students arrived with their overstuffed backpacks. My closest friends, Ryan, Jordan, and Miguel, had agreed to join after considerable persuasion. Ryan was the skeptic, constantly complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi, while Jordan saw it as an opportunity to impress some of the girls in our grade. Miguel, quiet and observant, went along because he trusted my judgment. Mrs. Henderson, our biology teacher and trip coordinator, checked names off her clipboard with military precision. Mr. Lawson, the gym teacher, loaded equipment into the school van while Miss Garcia, the youngest of our chaperones, tried to calm nervous parents. 15 students total, each carrying enough gear to survive what Mrs. Henderson dramatically called a communion with nature. The drive took us through progressively smaller towns until civilization gave way to dense forest. The trees grew thicker, taller, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the morning sun into dancing patches of gold. I pressed my face against the window, watching the landscape transform. Something about those woods felt different, older somehow, untouched by the modern world we were leaving behind. We reached the trailhead by noon and spent the next 5 hours hiking. The path wound upward through switchbacks that left even the athletes among us breathing hard. I found myself at the front of the group, setting a steady pace while helping others navigate the rougher sections. The forest seemed to close in around us as we climbed, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves creating a natural symphony that both calmed and unsettled me. Our campsite sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The teachers had chosen it well. Flat ground for tents, a nearby stream for water, and enough space between the trees to see the sky. We pitched our tents in a rough circle, with the teachers' tents forming a protective barrier on one side. Ryan, Jordan, Miguel, and I claimed a spot near the edge of the clearing, close enough to feel part of the group but far enough for privacy. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. We gathered around the campfire Mrs. Henderson had built, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows while she told stories about the area's history. Indigenous tribes had considered these mountains sacred, she said, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Mr. Lawson scoffed at the mysticism, but I noticed how his eyes kept scanning the tree line. The rule about lights out at 10 p.m. seemed ridiculous to 4 teenage boys armed with handheld gaming devices. We'd brought our Nintendo DS systems specifically for this trip. The new Pokémon games had released just weeks earlier, and we'd planned to trade and battle all weekend. The soft glow from our screens illuminated the tent walls as we huddled together, trying to muffle our excitement when someone caught a rare Pokémon or won a particularly challenging battle. Mrs. Henderson's flashlight beam sweeping across our tent killed the mood instantly. Her stern whisper carried enough authority to make us power down immediately. "Boys, you need rest for tomorrow's hike. No more games tonight." We complied, but sleep came slowly. The forest at night was anything but quiet. Branches creaked, small animals scurried through the underbrush, and occasionally something larger would move just beyond our ability to identify it. Saturday's hike pushed us further up the mountain, following a trail that seemed to narrow with each mile. I noticed things the others missed: fresh scratches on tree bark at shoulder height, areas where the underbrush had been disturbed recently, the way certain sections of forest fell completely silent as we passed through. When I mentioned it to Miguel, he just shrugged, but I saw him checking over his shoulder more frequently after that. By evening, exhaustion should have guaranteed sleep, but Ryan had other ideas. As we sat in our tent after dinner, he proposed we sneak out after midnight. "Come on," he whispered. "When else are we going to get a chance like this? No parents, middle of nowhere, just us and our games." Jordan immediately agreed, always ready for anything that felt rebellious. Miguel looked uncertain but wouldn't be the only one to refuse. I felt torn between my desire to follow rules and the need to maintain my friendship. The rational part of my brain understood the dangers: getting lost, encountering wildlife, facing serious consequences if caught. But 17-year-old logic won out. We weren't planning anything harmful, just moving far enough away to play without disturbing anyone. We feigned exhaustion after dinner, making a show of yawning and stretching before retreating to our tent earlier than usual. The waiting was agony. Every minute crawled by as we lay in our sleeping bags, fully dressed, listening to the camp settle into silence. By 11:30, the last conversations had died out. At midnight, Ryan gave the signal. We crept from our tent with practiced stealth, each step calculated to avoid twigs and dry leaves. The moon provided just enough light to navigate as we moved away from camp, following a deer trail Ryan had spotted earlier. About 200 yards out, we found a small grove with several fallen trees that formed natural benches, perfect for our purposes. The forest at night felt like a different world entirely. Shadows moved independently of the wind, and every sound seemed amplified. But once we powered on our games, that familiar electronic glow created a bubble of normalcy. We kept our voices low, communicating mainly through gestures and expressions as we traded Pokémon and battled. For 30 minutes, it was exactly what we'd hoped for: a secret adventure, a memory being forged. The rustling started gradually, so subtle we initially dismissed it as wind. But the pattern was wrong, too deliberate, too focused. We froze simultaneously, game still running but forgotten in our hands. The sound grew closer, branches snapping under weight that suggested something large. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, or worse, one of our teachers. What emerged from the darkness was far more unsettling than any animal or authority figure. The man appeared between two trees as if he'd materialized from shadow itself. Middle-aged, perhaps 45, with features that would have been unremarkable in any other context. His hair, dark with streaks of premature gray, was slicked back despite days of apparent wilderness exposure. His clothing, a business casual ensemble of khakis and a button-down shirt, seemed absurdly out of place, though dirt and wear suggested he'd been out here for some time. He moved with dreamlike deliberation, each step measured and purposeful. Without acknowledging our presence, without making eye contact, he lowered himself onto a log directly across from us, completing our circle. His gaze fixed on the ground between his feet, hands resting on his knees in perfect symmetry. The silence stretched beyond uncomfortable into something approaching surreal. We sat frozen, game still glowing in our hands, creating an eerie tableau in the darkness. The man remained perfectly still, so motionless, I found myself watching for the rise and fall of his chest to confirm he was actually breathing. He was. Ryan tried to communicate with his eyes, jerking his head slightly toward the path back to camp. Jordan's hands shook so badly his DS nearly slipped from his grip. Miguel had gone completely rigid, his normally dark complexion somehow pale in the electronic light. I wanted to speak, to ask the man who he was, what he wanted, but my throat had constricted to the point where breathing was difficult, let alone talking. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before we reached an unspoken agreement. On a silent count of 3, marked only by barely perceptible nods, we stood in unison. The man rose with us, matching our movement with unsettling precision. He still hadn't looked up, hadn't acknowledged us directly, but his body mirrored ours like a reflection in disturbed water. That's when I noticed his feet. Despite the business casual attire above, he wore no shoes. His bare feet were cut, bleeding in places, caked with dirt and pine needles. How long had he been walking through these woods? Where had he come from? The questions spiraled through my mind as we began backing away slowly. The moment we turned to run, everything changed. The man's head snapped up and I caught a glimpse of his eyes. Vacant, unfocused, yet somehow tracking our movement. He began following us, not quite running but moving with an unnatural gait that covered ground efficiently. His arms remained at his sides, never pumping for balance or speed, creating an impression of gliding rather than running. We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning any pretense of stealth. Branches tore at our clothes and skin. Roots tried to trip us, but fear propelled us forward. I led the group, relying on instinct and moonlight to find the path. Behind us, the man maintained his steady pace, never gaining but never falling behind, like he was tethered to us by an invisible rope of fixed length. The worst part was the silence. He made no sound, no heavy breathing, no grunts of exertion. Even his footfalls seemed muffled despite the debris-covered forest floor. Only the occasional snap of a branch marked his presence, each one sending fresh adrenaline through my system. Ryan stumbled once, crying out, and Jordan helped him up without breaking stride. Miguel ran beside me, his breathing ragged but determined. The campsite lights appeared through the trees like salvation. We didn't slow until we reached our tent, diving inside and zipping it shut with trembling fingers. We lay there panting, straining to hear over our own heartbeats. No one pursued us into camp. No footsteps approached our tent. The man had simply vanished back into the forest as mysteriously as he'd appeared. We spent the remaining hours until dawn in a state of hypervigilance. Every sound outside our tent triggered fresh panic. Was that footstep or falling pine cone? Wind through branches or breathing? The normal forest sounds we'd grown accustomed to now seemed sinister, potentially masking the approach of our silent pursuer. We whispered theories to each other, trying to make sense of what we'd encountered. Ryan suggested a homeless person, someone who'd gotten lost hiking and gone slightly mad from isolation. Jordan thought maybe it was someone with mental health issues who'd wandered away from a facility. Miguel said nothing for a long time, then quietly suggested that some things didn't need explaining, they just needed avoiding. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, the way they'd looked through us rather than at us. The man's presence had felt wrong on a fundamental level, like encountering something that wore the shape of a human but lacked the essential spark that made someone truly human. The business clothes, the bare feet, the mechanical movements. Every detail added to a picture that refused to form a coherent whole. As gray dawn light began filtering through the tent walls, we finally relaxed slightly. We could hear other campers beginning to stir, the normal sounds of a camp waking up. Mrs. Henderson's voice called out morning greetings. The ordinary world was reasserting itself, making the night's event seem almost dreamlike. Almost. We emerged from our tent looking haggard, which the teachers attributed to excitement and poor sleep. During breakfast, I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see that figure standing just inside the forest's edge, watching, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows, and my own paranoid imagination. The hike out that afternoon felt like an escape from a prison we'd voluntarily entered. Every step away from that place lightened the weight on my chest. We stayed close together, never straying from the group, jumping at unexpected movements in our peripheral vision. The other students noticed our subdued mood, but attributed it to exhaustion. During the van ride home, we held a whispered conference in the back seats. Should we tell someone? The debate was brief but intense. Telling meant admitting we'd broken rules, potentially facing suspension from school activities. Worse, would anyone believe us? A strange man in business clothes wandering the forest barefoot. It sounded like something from a bad horror movie. We decided on silence, a pact sealed by mutual fear and teenage logic. Years have passed since that night, but autumn always brings it back. I've researched the area extensively, looking for similar encounters, missing person reports, anything that might explain what we saw. I found nothing concrete, just occasional whispers from other hikers about feeling watched, about finding unusual footprints, about the sensation that something in those woods isn't quite right. Ryan and I lost touch after college, but we ran into each other at a reunion recently. After a few drinks, he brought up that night. He still has nightmares sometimes, he said. Dreams where he's back in those woods, playing his game, and slowly becomes aware that someone is sitting across from him in the darkness. He wakes up just as the figure begins to stand. Jordan became a police officer, driven by a need to protect others from the unexplainable things that lurk at the edges of our ordered world. Miguel went into psychology, fascinated by the human mind's capacity for both rationality and complete breakdown. I became a writer, trying to capture in words the feeling of that night, the wrongness of it, the way it shattered my comfortable assumptions about the world. I've never been camping again. I know that seems extreme, but some boundaries once crossed can't be uncrossed. The wilderness lost its innocence for me that night. Now, when I look at a forest, I don't see adventure and natural beauty. I see dark spaces between trees where things that shouldn't exist might be waiting, patient and still, for the next group of teenagers foolish enough to venture out after midnight. The logical part of my brain insists there's an explanation. The man was probably just a lost hiker, disoriented and harmless. His odd behavior could be attributed to exhaustion, dehydration, or mental illness. But logic fails to explain the feeling of absolute wrongness he emanated, the way he moved like someone puppeting a human body without quite understanding how it should work. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, wandering those trails in his dirty business clothes and bare feet, sitting down uninvited at campsites, following groups of kids through the darkness with that horrible gliding gait. I wonder what he wanted, what he was, and whether we were lucky to escape or whether he simply wasn't hunting us at all, just drawn to our light like a moth to flame, operating on instincts we couldn't begin to understand. The one thing I know for certain is this: there are things in the deep woods that defy explanation, and sometimes the smartest thing you can do is run. We were children playing with toys in a place where childhood should never venture after dark. We learned that night that some games aren't worth playing, and some memories once made can never be forgotten. It's been 6 months since we lost David. 6 months of a silence between my sister Chloe and me that felt heavier and more suffocating than any grief I could process. He was the glue, the vibrant laughing bridge between my pragmatism and her artistic chaos. With him gone, we were just two strangers sharing a history of inside jokes that no longer felt funny. The laughter had died with him on that mountain in Colorado, his body broken at the base of a cliff face I should have warned him about. I was the experienced climber. I was the one who should have seen the unstable rock. Instead, I watched him fall, and the sound of his body hitting the ground became the metronome of my nightmares. That's why I booked the cabin. I thought the Ozark National Forest, with its rugged, honest wilderness, could be the neutral territory where we might find our way back to each other. I thought the quiet would be healing. I thought wrong about a lot of things. The last few miles to the cabin were a testament to the word secluded. My sedan bounced and rattled over a winding dirt road the color of rust that seemed to burrow deeper into the earth with every turn. Towering oaks and hickories formed a dense canopy overhead, swallowing the late afternoon sun and plunging us into a humid green twilight. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my architect's mind cataloging the remoteness, the sheer distance from anything resembling civilization. We'd passed the last house, a dilapidated trailer with a rusted swing set in the yard nearly 40 minutes ago. Are we there yet? Chloe's voice was flat, devoid of its usual melodic lilt. She hadn't looked up from her sketchbook since we'd left the main highway. Her pencil moved in short, angry strokes across the page, creating something dark and twisted that I didn't want to examine too closely. Almost, I said, trying to inject some cheer into my tone. The owner said to look for a hand-carved sign, Still Water. The name should have been my first warning. Still water. Dead water. Water that doesn't move, doesn't flow, doesn't sustain life. The cabin, when we finally found it, sat in a small, lumpy clearing that looked like a wound in the forest. It was smaller than the pictures had suggested, built from massive dark logs that looked ancient, the gaps chinked with a gray crumbling mortar that resembled dried bone. It had the presence of something that had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it, a tumor of wood and stone pushing up through the soil. My first thought was of structural integrity, load-bearing walls, foundation stability, the age of the timber. Chloe's, I'm sure, was of its rustic charm, though even she seemed subdued as we stared at the structure. The porch sagged in the middle, and the windows were small and dark, like closed eyes. A stack of firewood sat beside the door, covered in a green film of moss that shouldn't have been there in the dry summer heat. The clearing itself was wrong too, perfectly circular, as if something had scorched or poisoned the ground years ago, preventing anything from growing back properly. Only sparse, yellowed grass covered the hard-packed earth. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. But underneath was something else, something organic and rotting, like vegetables left too long in a root cellar. A single large room served as living, dining, and sleeping space with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was sturdy, handmade, and worn smooth with time. 2 narrow beds occupied opposite corners, their mattresses thin and lumpy. A wooden table with mismatched chairs sat in the center of the room, and a tiny kitchen area with a hand pump for water occupied the back wall. Well, it's authentic, I said, running a hand over the rough-hewn mantle. My fingers came away covered in a fine gray dust. Chloe finally looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes the same deep brown as David's, scanning the room. For a moment I thought she would turn around and walk right back out to the car. Then something in her face shifted, a kind of resignation settling over her features. "It's perfect," she whispered, a ghost of her old smile touching her lips. But her eyes remained dead. The first day was a fragile truce. We unpacked in silence, each of us claiming our respective corners of the cabin like territorial animals. I organized my things with methodical precision. Clothes folded and stacked, toiletries arranged by size, my laptop and phone charging from the solar battery pack I'd brought. Chloe scattered her belongings with her usual creative chaos, art supplies spilling across her bed, clothes draped over chair backs, half-empty water bottles collecting on every surface. By mid-morning, the cabin felt claustrophobic. We needed space, air, distance from each other and from our own thoughts. I suggested we tackle a 5-mile loop of the Ozark Highlands Trail. The trail map showed a route that would take us up to a ridgeline with panoramic views before looping back to the cabin. It would be strenuous, but the physical exertion would leave us little breath for conversation, which suited us both fine. The hike started well enough. The trail was clearly marked with white blazes painted on tree trunks, and the morning was still relatively cool under the forest canopy. We climbed steadily, our boots crunching on the leaf litter, the only sounds our breathing, and the occasional bird call overhead. The forest here was beautiful in its wildness. Massive oaks and hickories hundreds of years old, their trunks thick as cars, their branches forming a ceiling so dense that little sunlight reached the forest floor. Ferns and moss carpeted the ground, and every few hundred yards we'd cross a small creek, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. But as we climbed higher, I began to notice things that my rational mind tried to dismiss but my gut couldn't ignore. The trees near the trail bore marks. Deep gouges in the bark, some old and weathered, others fresh and oozing sap. They were too high and too deep to be from deer rubbing their antlers, too wide and too irregular to be from bears sharpening their claws. They looked like something had dragged itself past, scraping its body against the trunk, leaving behind parallel grooves that ran vertically down the bark. I didn't point them out to Chloe. She was already fragile enough. The air grew thick and hot as the sun climbed toward noon, the humidity pressing down on us like a wet blanket. Sweat soaked through our shirts and dripped from our faces. My bad knee, a souvenir from a climbing accident years ago, began to throb, but I pushed through it. At the summit, the view was exactly as promised. A sweeping panorama of rolling green mountains stretching to the horizon, ridge after ridge fading into a blue haze. It should have been breathtaking. Instead, it felt oppressive, as if the entire forest was watching us, waiting for something. We ate our sandwiches in near silence, but it was a comfortable silence for the first time in months. I caught Chloe looking at a hawk circling on the thermals, a genuine spark of interest in her eyes. It was a start. Maybe this trip wouldn't be a complete disaster after all. The descent was easier on our legs, but harder on our nerves. The temperature had continued to climb, and by the time we stumbled back into the clearing around the cabin, we were both exhausted and dehydrated. We spent the afternoon in a kind of stupor, sprawled on the porch, drinking water and watching the shadows lengthen across the clearing. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the tree line, I noticed it first. The gradual dimming of the forest sounds. The insects, the birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was like someone was slowly turning down the volume on the world. By the time the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked disturbingly like blood, the forest had gone completely silent. It wasn't the gradual layered hush of a normal forest night, where one sound fades as another begins, crickets replacing songbirds, owls replacing hawks. This was abrupt, like a switch had been flipped. One moment the air was filled with the chittering of insects and the droning of cicadas. The next, there was nothing. A profound, unnatural silence pressed in on the cabin from all sides, so complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears and the mechanical ticking of my wristwatch. "Do you hear that?" Chloe asked, her voice a little too loud in the stillness. She had set down her sketchbook and was staring out into the darkening woods, her body tense. "Hear what?" "There's nothing to hear," I said, trying to sound dismissive, trying to convince myself as much as her. But she was right. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a library or a sleeping house. It was an absence, a void where sound should have been, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We went inside as darkness fell, suddenly uncomfortable on the exposed porch. I locked the door and wedged a chair under the knob, an old habit from my years living alone in the city. Chloe raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. We made dinner on the propane camp stove. Instant ramen with vegetables, instant coffee, granola bars for dessert. The meal was utilitarian and tasteless, but we were both too unsettled to care about food. The silence outside remained absolute. No wind, no animals, no insects, nothing. We sat at the wooden table, our forks scraping against our bowls the only sound, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would bridge the gap between us, but every potential sentence died in my throat. What was there to say? Sorry I let our brother die. Sorry I've been a terrible sister. Sorry I dragged you out to this God-forsaken place. We went to bed early, more to escape each other than from any real tiredness. I lay on my narrow bed, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, counting knots in the wood to keep my mind from wandering to darker places. From across the room I could hear Chloe's breathing, quick and shallow, the breathing of someone pretending to sleep. Outside, the silence continued, pressing against the thin walls of the cabin like a living thing. The second night, the silence returned with the sunset, heavier and more complete than before. We didn't bother with the pretense of normalcy. We sat on the porch, nursing cups of lukewarm tea that neither of us really wanted, the quiet stretching our nerves taut. The stars overhead were brilliant, more stars than I'd seen in years, but their beauty felt cold and distant and utterly indifferent to our presence. Then a new sound started, a slow rhythmic scrape, scrape coming from the edge of the woods. It was the sound of rock grinding on rock, deliberate and methodical, with a weight behind it that I could almost feel vibrating through the ground. "What is that?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. A small amount of tea sloshed over the rim, spattering on her jeans. "A deer, maybe rubbing its antlers on a rock," I offered, my own heart beginning to beat a little faster. But even as I said it, I knew it was wrong. The sound was too heavy, too consistent, too purposeful. Deer were random, sporadic in their movements. This was rhythmic, almost mechanical in its precision. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause, scrape. The sound continued for nearly an hour, seeming to move parallel to our clearing, staying just inside the tree line where the darkness was absolute. I tried to track it, to pinpoint its location, but the acoustics of the forest were deceptive. Sometimes it sounded like it was directly ahead of us. Other times it seemed to come from behind the cabin. Once I could have sworn it was above us, in the trees themselves, though that made no logical sense. My analytical mind tried to catalog possibilities. A bear rubbing against a tree, though that wouldn't produce the grinding sound. A falling branch scraping against stone, though the rhythm was too regular. Some kind of geological process, rocks settling in the heat of the day, though that didn't explain the movement or the weight behind it. With each possibility, my rational explanations grew thinner, more desperate. Chloe's hand found mine on the armrest between our chairs. Her palm was slick with sweat and trembling. We sat there, two sisters united in fear, as the scraping continued its slow patrol around our clearing. Finally, after what felt like hours, it faded away, moving deeper into the forest. The silence rushed back in, somehow even more oppressive now that we knew what could fill it. We went to bed that night with the flimsy cabin door locked, the chair wedged firmly under the knob, and our hiking boots on, laced tight, just in case. Of what? I didn't let myself consider. I told myself we were being ridiculous, that fear was making us paranoid, that there was a rational explanation for everything, but I didn't believe it. Not anymore. The next day, a pervasive feeling of being watched followed us everywhere. We tried another hike, determined not to let our fears trap us inside the cabin, but every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. The beauty of the forest had transformed into something menacing, the trees no longer majestic but imprisoning, their branches like reaching arms, their trunks like the bars of a cage. We cut the hike short, returning to the cabin before noon, both of us jumpy and exhausted though we'd barely walked 3 miles. That evening, the scraping started earlier, while the sun was still setting. while we could still see the tree line clearly in the fading light. It was louder, too, and unmistakably closer. It was coming from the darkest part of the woods, where the trail we'd hiked earlier disappeared into shadow, where the trees grew so close together that even in daylight it looked like dusk. "I'm going to see what it is," I said, my voice betraying a confidence I didn't feel. But the not knowing was worse than the knowing. The uncertainty was eating at me, my architect's brain demanding concrete answers, measurable data, something I could understand and therefore control. "Maya, no." Chloe grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to bruise. Her face was pale, her eyes showing white all around the irises. "We have to know," I insisted, pulling away. Grabbing the heavy-duty flashlight from my pack, a solid metal maglite that could serve as a weapon if needed, I marched toward the edge of the clearing, Chloe trailing hesitantly behind me, her presence both a comfort and an added weight of responsibility. The scraping stopped as soon as I started moving, as if whatever was making it knew I was coming, as if it was waiting. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the tree line, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, creating only a small circle of illumination that made everything beyond it seem even darker by contrast. Then I pointed the beam at the ground, at the boundary where the cleared earth of our campsite met the forest floor. My breath caught in my throat. The flashlight trembled in my hand, making the beam dance and waver. There, in the hard-packed, damp earth at the edge of the forest, were two deep parallel gouges. They were about a foot apart and dug several inches into the soil, deep enough that they'd broken through the topsoil and exposed the pale limestone beneath. They ran for about 6 feet, perfectly parallel, before disappearing into the underbrush. They looked as if something impossibly heavy, with two stone-like points or edges, had dragged itself out of the woods and then back in again. The displaced dirt was still dark and moist, piled up on the sides of the grooves like the wake behind a boat. They were fresh, made within the last few hours. Chloe let out a small, choked gasp behind me. I could hear her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. The beginning of a panic attack I'd seen too many times since David died. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't look away from the marks. My mind was racing through possibilities, trying to find a rational explanation. A plow? Out here miles from any road? A fallen tree? Trees don't leave parallel grooves. Some kind of vehicle? There were no tire tracks, no other disturbance. We stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, illuminating those terrible grooves in the earth. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart, and Chloe's shallow, rapid breathing beside me. The rational explanations, a fallen tree, some kind of farm equipment, anything, died in my mind before they could fully form. There was nothing rational about the marks in the ground. They were too deep, too deliberate, too recent. And in the heavy, pressing silence of the Ozark night, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that whatever had made them was still out there in the dark, and it was coming for us. We scrambled back into the cabin, slamming the door and fumbling with the deadbolt. The chair I had wedged under the knob last night now seemed like a child's toy, laughably inadequate against whatever had carved through limestone like it was soft clay. We didn't speak. There were no words for what we had seen, no vocabulary to describe the fear that gripped us, bone deep and primal. This wasn't the clean academic fear of statistics and probabilities. This was the fear that lived in our genetic memory, the fear that kept our ancestors alive when the night was full of predators and the only defense was fire and stone. The silence that had been our companion for 2 nights was now our enemy, a canvas against which every terrifying possibility could be painted. We dragged both beds to the center of the room, pushed them together, and sat back to back on them, facing opposite directions so we could watch both the door and the windows. The flashlight sat between us, within easy reach. My phone showed no signal, as it had since we arrived. Chloe's was the same. We were alone, truly alone, in a way that city dwellers never are. And then the scraping started again. Not from the edge of the woods this time. It was in the clearing. It was slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Each scrape was a drawn-out grinding sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine, resonating in my bones. My mind, usually a safe harbor of logic and reason, was a storm of raw fear. I thought of the gouges in the earth, the sheer weight required to carve into solid rock. I thought of the marks on the trees, too high and too deep for any animal I knew. I thought of David falling, his scream cutting off abruptly, and realized I might hear Chloe scream the same way before this night was over. Scrape, scrape. It was at the porch steps now. The wood creaked and groaned under a pressure it was never designed to bear. I heard nails popping loose, wood splintering, the sound of something immensely heavy testing each step before committing its full weight. The boards of the porch protested with high-pitched squeals that made me think of animals caught in traps. Chloe had backed against me, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and dark. Tears streamed down her face, silent and constant. Her whole body was shaking so violently that I could feel it through my back. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't lie to her. Not now. Not when we could both hear death scraping its way toward us across the porch. Scrape. It was on the porch proper now, the boards bowing and cracking under its weight. The sound was deafeningly close, a heavy dragging weight accompanied by the grinding of stone on wood. Then a new sound, a low grinding noise, like stone rubbing against the logs of the cabin wall right next to the boarded-up window. The wall itself vibrated with the pressure. Dust and bits of ancient mortar rained down from the chinks between the logs. Curiosity, or maybe some desperate need to understand the source of our terror, propelled me forward. Every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was, to curl into a ball and hide. But my analytical mind needed to see, to know, to understand. I crept to the window, my body trembling so violently I thought I might shake apart. I peered through a small, grimy pane of glass between two of the thick wooden slats. What I saw broke something fundamental in my understanding of the world. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I had a name for. Anything I could catalog or explain or fit into my neat mental boxes of taxonomy and biology. A hulking, vaguely humanoid shape blotted out the faint moonlight. Its body was a lumpy, asymmetrical mass of what looked like wet river rocks, dark moss, and thick gnarled roots, all fused together into something that resembled a human form, the way a child's first drawing resembles a person. The basic structure was there, but wrong, all wrong. It stood maybe 8 feet tall, its proportions disturbing. Torso too long, limbs too thick and irregular, head too small for the massive body. The surface was textured with stones of various sizes, some smooth and round like river stones, others jagged and sharp like freshly broken flint. Between the stones, moss grew in thick patches, dripping with moisture despite the dry weather. And threaded through everything were roots, thick pale roots like exposed tendons, some as thin as string, others as thick as my arm, all woven together in a grotesque parody of muscle and sinew. It had no face, no eyes, no features at all. Where a head should be was just another lump of stone and moss, blank and terrible in its emptiness. It was just a thing of stone and earth and ancient organic matter, animated by some unknowable force, moving with a ponderous deliberateness that was somehow more terrifying than any fast predatory movement would have been. Two long, heavy limbs ended in points of jagged rock, the source of the gouges. As I watched, frozen in horror, it dragged one of them against the wall again, testing its strength with a slow, relentless pressure. Splinters of wood flew from the log surface. The whole cabin shuddered. A deep primal part of my brain screamed, but I couldn't make a sound. My throat had closed up, my breath trapped in my lungs. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this impossible thing, this violation of every natural law I'd ever learned. "Maya, what is it?" Chloe's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible. I couldn't answer. I just backed away from the window, shaking my head, my hands pressed against my mouth to keep from screaming. The image was burned into my mind, seared into my memory with the intensity of a traumatic wound. The sight of it, the sheer wrongness of it, broke something in me. For a moment, all I could see was David falling, the rope snapping, my own hand reaching out, grasping at empty air. I had failed to save him. I would not fail to save Chloe. That single thought cut through the fog of my fear like a knife. The creature moved to the front of the cabin. A tremendous grinding pressure was applied to the door. It wasn't the frantic attack of a bear trying to reach food. It wasn't the panicked scrambling of any animal. It was slow, methodical, and patient. The action of something that had all the time in the world, something that knew its prey was trapped and couldn't escape. The thick oak of the door began to groan, the wood fibers screaming in protest. Splinters of wood rained down from the door frame. Dust and bits of deteriorated mortar trickled from the ceiling like snow. We were in a box, and something was trying to patiently pry it open. like a child taking apart a puzzle box to get at the candy inside. Chloe let out a sob, a raw sound of pure terror that seemed to come from her soul. "We're going to die here." "No, we're not," I said, my voice shaking but firm. My mind was racing, running through options, discarding them as quickly as they formed. Fight? With what? Run. The front door was blocked. Windows. Most were too small, and the ones that weren't were boarded over. "Think, Chloe. Think." "I can't," she cried, her body racked with shudders. Then her eyes went wide with something other than fear. A memory. "The map," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at my backpack, which had fallen near the door when we'd scrambled away from the window. The map. There was an old trail, a logging trail. It went to a fire tower. A fire tower. A metal structure high off the ground, impossible for anything that heavy to climb. A place we could see from all directions, where nothing could sneak up on us. A place with a radio, maybe, or at least visibility. A place where we might signal for help. A chance. A slim, desperate chance, but the only one we had. I scrambled for the pack, my hands clumsy as I unzipped it and pulled out the crumpled topographic map. While the creature's attention was focused on its slow, grinding assault on the front door, I spread the map on the floor, using the flashlight to read it. Chloe pressed close beside me, her breath hot on my cheek, her fear bleeding into mine. In the dim light we found it, a thin dotted line labeled Old Logging Redip, branching off the main trail about a half-mile back the way we'd come. It snaked through the contour lines for several miles before ending at a small symbol marked FT, Fire Tower. The elevation change was significant, maybe 800 feet, mostly uphill. Normally in daylight it would take maybe 2 hours. In the dark with something hunting us, I didn't hope, as sharp and painful as a needle, pierced through my fear. "The back window," I whispered, pointing to the small square window above the kitchen sink. It was maybe 2 feet on a side, barely big enough for us to squeeze through, but it was our only option. The window faced away from the porch, away from where the creature was focused on destroying the front door. The creature at the door gave a tremendous shove, and a loud crack echoed through the cabin. I saw the wood around the deadbolt beginning to splinter. We didn't have much time. While the grinding and splintering at the front of the cabin covered our movements, we worked on the window. It was swollen shut with decades of humidity, the frame warped and sealed with layers of old paint. We put our shoulders into it, grunting with effort, trying to be quiet but desperate enough not to care about the noise we made. For a terrifying moment, it wouldn't budge. I could feel time running out, could hear the door beginning to give way behind us. Panic clawed at my throat. Then, with a shriek of protesting wood that seemed impossibly loud, the window gave way, swinging open into the night. Cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of forest decay and damp earth. Beyond the window was darkness, absolute and impenetrable. I hoisted Chloe up. "Go, don't look back, just run for the trail." She scrambled through, her body barely fitting through the narrow opening. I heard her drop to the soft ground outside with a thud and a gasp. I followed, hoisting myself up on the sink, pushing my shoulders through the opening. For a horrible moment, I thought I was stuck, my hips too wide, my pack snagging on something. Behind me, I heard a tremendous crack as the front door finally gave way. I pushed harder, feeling skin scrape away on the window frame, not caring. And then I was through, falling, landing awkwardly on my ankle. A sharp pain shot up my leg, bright and immediate. I had to bite down on my cry, but I ignored the pain, scrambling to my feet. We didn't dare look back, though I could hear it now. The sound of heavy footsteps inside the cabin, methodical and slow, the creature exploring the space we'd just escaped from. Behind us, the cabin's back wall shuddered as it moved inside. We ran. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, drawing blood, catching in our clothes and hair. The oppressive silence of the forest had returned now that the scraping had ceased, making every sound we made seem amplified, a beacon advertising our location. The only sounds were our own ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of our feet on the damp earth. The moon was a sliver, offering little light to guide us through the absolute darkness under the canopy. We ran with our hands outstretched like blind people, feeling for trees before we crashed into them, stumbling over roots and rocks, falling and scrambling back up without pause. Every shadow was a monster. Every rustle of leaves was a new threat. The image of the rock and moss thing, faceless and relentless, propelled us onward. Our fear a cold, hard knot in my stomach that pushed us beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, into a place of pure survival instinct. We ran blindly, desperately into the suffocating darkness of the woods. My lungs were on fire. Every breath was a ragged, tearing gasp that did nothing to quell the burning in my chest. Pain, sharp and insistent, radiated up from my ankle with every jarring step. Beside me, Chloe ran with a wild, desperate energy, her face pale and streaked with dirt in the faint moonlight that occasionally penetrated the canopy. The woods were a disorienting maze of black trunks and grasping branches. We ran without clear direction, propelled only by the memory of splintering wood and the image of that faceless rock-hewn thing dragging itself through our cabin. Just when I thought my legs would give out, that I would collapse right there on the forest floor and never get up again, my foot caught on something. Not a root, but a rut. I stumbled and fell hard, my bad ankle twisting beneath me. I cried out, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the immense silence, as if the forest itself had absorbed it. Maya. Chloe was at my side instantly, hauling me up with strength I didn't know she had. I'm okay, I gasped, though my vision swam with pain and I could feel warm blood trickling down my shin where I'd scraped it on a rock. I looked down, trying to get my bearings. It wasn't just one rut. It was two faint parallel depressions in the earth, mostly overgrown with weeds and small saplings, but still discernible beneath the plant growth. It was a path, a man-made path, the old logging trail. Hope, thin and fragile as spider silk, flickered within me. We had found it. We followed the faint trail, half running, half stumbling. It was a grueling, endless journey through the dark. My ankle sent bolts of agony up my leg with every step. Sweat stung my eyes and soaked through my clothes. My throat was raw from gasping for air. The silence pressed in, a physical weight that seemed to slow us down, to make every step harder. I found myself listening, straining to hear the scrape of rock on rock behind us, the sound of pursuit, but there was nothing. Only the sound of our own labored breathing, and the crunch of our feet on the forest debris. The absence of pursuit was almost as terrifying as the pursuit itself. Where had it gone? Was it following us silently? Was it ahead of us, waiting? Could something that large move without sound? My mind conjured images of it standing just off the trail, perfectly still, letting us run past before reaching out with those terrible stone limbs. The trail climbed steadily, and my injured ankle screamed with every upward step. Chloe stayed beside me, half supporting me, neither of us speaking because we needed every ounce of breath for movement. Time lost meaning. It could have been an hour or 3 hours. I had no way to know. My world had contracted to the next step, and the next and the next. The sky ahead began to soften almost imperceptibly from impenetrable black to a deep bruised purple. The first hint of approaching dawn, and then we saw it. As we crested a small rise, a silhouette emerged against the lightening sky, a stark skeletal structure of metal crossbeams and struts pointing a finger at the heavens, the fire tower. It rose maybe 60 feet into the air, a testament to a bygone era of forest management. Even from a distance I could see the rust on the metal, the age of the structure, but it was there, it was real, and it was our salvation. The sight broke through our exhaustion. We summoned a final desperate burst of energy, adrenaline flooding our systems, giving us strength we shouldn't have had. We scrambled up the steep incline toward its base, grabbing at saplings and rocks to pull ourselves up faster. The tower was old, rusted, and forgotten. A chain-link fence surrounded it, the metal corroded, the warning signs faded and illegible. But a section had long ago collapsed, probably torn down by weather or vandals, leaving a gap we could squeeze through. We squeezed through and ran to the base of the metal staircase that spiraled up into the sky. The steps were narrow, made of perforated metal that would give any modern safety inspector a heart attack. But I had never been so happy to see rusted steel in my life. The climb was terrifying in its own right. The metal steps groaned and creaked under our weight, slick with morning dew. Some of the bolts holding the structure together were missing, leaving the railing loose and wobbly. With every upward step I expected a rung to give way, sending us plummeting back into the darkness. We didn't stop, didn't look down, just climbed and climbed, our hands gripping the railing so hard that my fingers went numb. 60 feet has never seemed so far. My legs burned. My ankle was a source of constant agony. But we climbed, step after step, the spiral staircase seeming to go on forever. Finally, we reached the small glass-paneled cab at the very top. I shoved the door open. Thankfully it wasn't locked, and we collapsed inside, huddling together on the floor, our bodies shaking uncontrollably, too exhausted even to cry. From our vantage point, as our breathing slowly returned to normal and the adrenaline began to fade, we watched the sun rise. It was the most beautiful and welcome sight of my life. Ribbons of orange and pink unfurled across the horizon, pushing back the shadows and illuminating the vast rolling sea of the Ozark National Forest. The dark, menacing forest of night transformed into something beautiful again, under the light of day. Just trees, just hills, just nature. And with the light came sound. First a single bird chirped tentatively, as if testing whether it was safe. Then another joined in. Within minutes the air was filled with a chorus of bird song, the rustle of wind through the canopy, the hum of insects, the normal natural sounds of the world reasserting themselves. The unnatural silence was broken, pushed back by the sun, by the daylight, by reality reasserting itself over nightmare. We were safe. We stayed in the tower until the sun was high in the sky, its full light a comforting blanket. We found an old logbook, its pages yellowed and water-stained, with entries dating back to 2016, the last time anyone had been here. We found emergency supplies, bottles of water, energy bars, a first aid kit. We treated my ankle, wrapping it tightly, and ate the stale energy bars without tasting them. We were alive. That was all that mattered. We made the difficult choice. The car, our phones, my laptop, Chloe's art supplies, all of it would be left behind at the cabin. They were just things, replaceable. We could not bring ourselves to hike back, could not force ourselves to approach that clearing again, to see what might be waiting. The walk out, following the logging trail to where it eventually met a gravel service road, was a long, nerve-wracking ordeal. Even in daylight, every shadow seemed to hold a lurking shape. Every snap of a twig made us jump. It took hours before we finally saw a plume of dust from an approaching truck. An old Ford driven by a park ranger. A man in his 60s with weathered skin and kind eyes. He saw our torn clothes, our scratched faces, my swollen ankle and our exhaustion, and listened with a patient, practiced skepticism as we told him we got lost, that a bear had torn apart our cabin. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. Who would believe the truth? We didn't even fully believe it ourselves, not in the bright light of day, not sitting in the cab of his truck with the radio playing country music and the air conditioning blowing. He nodded, his expression giving nothing away, and drove us back to the nearest town. A small place called Ferndale. Population maybe 1,500. We filed a report with the local sheriff, who promised to send someone to check on the cabin and retrieve our belongings. We gave him directions, marked the location on his map. We never heard from him again. We didn't push it. We took a Greyhound bus back to the city, leaving that entire chapter of our lives behind in the Arkansas woods. We sat in the back, watching the mountains disappear behind us, neither of us speaking about what had happened, both of us knowing we never would. Months have passed. Winter has come and gone. Chloe and I talk now. We talk about everything except that night. The shared terror forged a bond between us that grief had nearly shattered. She's sculpting again. Not with wood and stone. She can't touch stone anymore, but with welded metal, creating things of stark angular beauty, abstract pieces that galleries are starting to notice. I'm designing buildings again, finding comfort in the solid, predictable laws of physics in foundations and load-bearing walls and structures that make sense. We meet for coffee every week, sometimes twice a week. We are survivors. That is our ending. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone in my apartment, and the city outside has fallen into a momentary hush between the passing of one car and the arrival of another, in that brief pocket of silence, I can still feel it, that profound, unnatural stillness. And I remember the slow, rhythmic scrape of rock on rock, and the faceless, silent thing that lurks in the deep woods waiting in the stillness of the Ozarks. We know what we saw. We know that there are places humans shouldn't go, where the normal rules don't apply, where things exist that have no place in our understanding of the world, and we know that we were lucky to escape with only our memories and our nightmares. Some people, I think, aren't so lucky. Some people never make it out at all. They say you never forget your first encounter with true terror. For me, that unforgettable brush with the unknown came on July 9, 2008 in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains. My name is Dalton Hayes and I'm an electrician by trade, born and raised in the concrete jungle of New York City. The wild, untamed expanses of upstate New York were about as far from my everyday reality as you could get. But that was precisely the appeal when my childhood buddy Ezra suggested we rent a cabin up there for the long weekend. Come on, man. It'll be great. Ezra had cajoled over beers at our regular dive bar. Fresh air, fishing, a chance to actually see some stars for once. When was the last time you got out of this urban hellhole? He had a point. The daily grind of the city. The incessant noise, the crowds, the grime. It had a way of wearing a man down to his bones. The thought of escaping to a place where the loudest sound was wind in the trees and my only obligation was keeping a cooler stocked with beer. Well, it had an undeniable allure. So that's how I found myself bumping along a barely there dirt track, deep in the Adirondack woods, crammed into the passenger seat of Ezra's ancient pickup. With every pothole and jounce, I found myself questioning the wisdom of this little excursion. "You sure this rust bucket is gonna make it, Ez?" I asked, bracing myself against the dashboard as we dipped into yet another crater masquerading as a road. "Have some faith, city boy." Ezra grinned, patting the dashboard with a grease-stained hand. "Old Blue might not look like much, but she's tougher than she looks. Kinda like her owner." I snorted, taking in Ezra's stocky frame, the faded flannel straining across his beer gut. "Yeah, you're a real mountain man, all right. When was the last time you even left Brooklyn?" "Hey, I'll have you know my dad used to take me hunting up here every fall as a kid. Taught me everything he knew about tracking, survival in the wilderness, all that good stuff. This is my natural habitat, man." I held up my hands in mock surrender. All right. I bow to your superior outdoor skills, oh great woodsman. Just get us to this damn cabin in one piece, will ya?" Ezra just chuckled, cranking up the radio until the twangy strains of some country tune drowned out the truck's protesting engine. An hour and a few close calls with the local wildlife later, we finally pulled up in front of our home for the next few days. To call it rustic would have been an understatement. The rough-hewn log cabin looked like it had been plucked straight from the pages of a frontier novel. All weathered timbers and a slightly sagging porch. But any concerns about the accommodations flew out of my head as soon as I stepped out of the truck. The view was breathtaking. The cabin perched on the edge of a glassy lake, its surface reflecting the emerald pines and azure sky like a pristine mirror. The air smelled of earth and evergreen and a subtle, clean scent I couldn't quite place but I knew instinctively belonged to the unsullied wild. "Okay, I take it back," I said, breathing deep. "This is pretty damn spectacular. How'd you even find this place?" Ezra shrugged, already starting to unload our gear from the truck bed. "Friend of a friend knew a guy. You know how it goes. Apparently this place doesn't get much use, so we got it dirt cheap. Fine by me. More space between us and the nearest annoying tourist, right?" I couldn't argue with that. The isolation that had unsettled me on the drive-in now felt like a blessing, a cocoon against the stresses and demands of the outside world. Out here it was just me, my best friend, and the unspoiled beauty of the mountains. If only I had known then how fleeting that sense of peace would be, how the very isolation I craved would soon become a trap, turning the wilderness from a tranquil haven to a stalking ground for something I still can't fully explain or understand to this day. But in that moment, basking in the warm afternoon sunlight, cold beer in hand as Ezra got a campfire going, all felt right in the world. I was exactly where I needed to be, even if I didn't realize that where I needed to be was as far away from those woods as humanly possible. The first day passed in a pleasant blur of hiking, fishing, and just generally soaking up the peaceful atmosphere. As the sun began its lazy descent towards the tree line, painting the sky in vivid streaks of orange and pink, Ezra and I settled in by the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth. The warmth of the alcohol mingled pleasantly with the bone-deep relaxation from a day spent in nature's embrace. Ezra was in the middle of a long yarn about his last failed romantic entanglement when the first discordant note crept into the evening's tranquility. It started as a sound, a faint scratching noise from the direction of the cabin.
At first I dismissed it, figuring it was just the wind rustling through the dried leaves clinging to the old logs, but it persisted, growing louder and more distinct until it was impossible to ignore.
Ezra trailed off mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he cocked his head towards the sound. "You hear that? Sounds like something's trying to get in." A prickle of unease crept up my spine as my mind conjured up images of hungry bears or ill-tempered raccoons. But I forced a laugh, trying to dispel the sudden tension. It's probably just some critter looking for an easy meal. We should have been more careful with the trash. Even as I said it, something about my own words rang hollow. There was an edge to the sound, a persistence that didn't feel quite natural. But Ezra seemed to accept my explanation, shrugging and turning back to the fire. We lapsed into a silence that no longer felt quite so companionable, both of us stealing the occasional glance towards the cabin. The scratching continued, rising and falling in an erratic rhythm. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. Ezra let out a nervous chuckle. "Maybe you were right about the bears. Guess it gave up when it realized there was no picnic basket waiting." "Yeah," I agreed, trying to match his forcibly light tone. "Yogi'll have to find his snacks somewhere else tonight." We settled back into our fireside banter, but the earlier ease was gone, replaced by a watchfulness I could see mirrored in the tense set of Ezra's shoulders. As we banked the fire and made our way inside, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had shifted in the atmosphere of our little oasis. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Even with a few more shots of whiskey humming through my veins, I found myself tossing and turning on the lumpy mattress, straining my ears against the oppressive silence of the cabin's interior. The night pressed in close, somehow seeming fuller, heavier than any darkness I'd experienced before. Every creak of settling wood, every sigh of the wind through the eaves set my nerves jangling. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, and Ezra's story playing tricks on my imagination. But some primal instinct, some inherited echo from the days when our ancestors huddled around flickering fires and jumped at shadows, kept me on a razor's edge of alertness. It was in that liminal space between waking and dreaming that I heard it, a heavy thump against the back door. My heart leapt into my throat as I bolted upright, the bedsprings protesting loudly in the stillness. For a moment I sat frozen, every muscle taut as a bowstring as I strained to hear over the thunder of my own pulse. But there was only silence and the soft snores drifting from Ezra's room. I tried to convince myself it had just been the house settling, or maybe a branch falling against the door. Anything but the alternative my lizard brain kept throwing up. Something large and powerful, testing the cabin's defenses. I finally drifted into an uneasy doze just as the first pale fingers of dawn began to creep across the sky. My dreams were a confused jumble of dark shapes and yellowed fangs, the scratching at the window a constant unsettling soundtrack. When I stumbled into the kitchen the next morning, gritty-eyed and cotton-mouthed, Ezra was already up, staring pensively into a mug of coffee. He glanced up as I entered, the bruised crescents under his eyes telling me I wasn't the only one who'd had a restless night. "Mornin'," he mumbled, nodding towards the coffee pot. "Hope you slept better than I did. Felt like every damn squirrel in the forest was tap dancing on the roof last night." I grunted non-committally, pouring myself a cup of the strong black brew. As the caffeine began to work its magic, I debated whether to bring up the scratching, the heavy thump in the night. But something held me back, an irrational fear that speaking the words aloud would give them weight, make them real in a way I wasn't quite ready to face. So instead, I did what any city dweller worth his salt would do when confronted with the unsettling specter of the unknown. I buried it deep and focused on the concrete realities of bacon and eggs and the day's plans. But even as we set out for a day of swimming and hiking, Ezra determinedly chipper despite the strain around his eyes. I couldn't quite shake the uneasiness that had taken root in my gut. It followed me like a shadow, an uninvited guest on our little getaway that I couldn't seem to shake. As we tromped through the sun-dappled forest, the spicy scent of pine thick in our nostrils, I found myself jumping at every snapped twig, every rustle in the undergrowth. More than once I could have sworn I felt eyes on the back of my neck, a prickling certainty of being watched that had me whipping around only to be confronted with the empty woods. Ezra seemed similarly on edge, his usual exuberant chatter replaced by a tense watchfulness. We stuck closer to the cabin than originally planned, both of us unconsciously gravitating towards the illusion of safety offered by those rough-hewn walls. As the sun began its inevitable descent once more, painting the sky in shades of fire, The uneasiness that had dogged our steps all day crystallized into a leaden ball in the pit of my stomach. Something about the encroaching twilight felt different, heavier, like the very air was holding its breath in anticipation. We went through the motions of building a fire, cooking dinner over the flames, but there was no joy in it, no relaxation. The banter felt forced, brittle, each of us straining to hear past the crackle of the flames for any sign of the return of last night's visitor. It was fully dark by the time we gave up the pretense and retreated to the dubious sanctuary of the cabin. Ezra claimed first shower, leaving me to double and triple check the locks on the doors and windows, as if a thin veneer of brass and wood could stand against the growing certainty that something out there in the night had marked us, had decided we were fair game in a hunt we hadn't signed up for. I was just contemplating the merits of dragging the heavy oak dresser in front of the back door when the first guttural snarl sliced through the silence. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a cross between a wild dog's growl and the primal roar of some great cat, but threaded through it was an almost human quality, a dark intelligence that turned my blood to ice water in my veins. "Ezra," I called out, ashamed at the tremor in my voice. "Please tell me that was you practicing your mating call, and not what I think it was." There was a beat of silence. Then Ezra emerged from the bathroom, his face pale beneath his usual ruddy complexion. "Unless my mating call sounds like a pissed-off grizzly with a sore throat. I don't think so, brother." We stood there staring at each other, the unspoken question heavy in the air between us. What the hell was that, and what did it want with us? Before either of us could formulate a response, the thudding began. It was the sound from the night before amplified 100-fold, a rhythmic pounding that shook the very foundation of the cabin. It was coming from all sides, the walls vibrating with each thunderous impact. Ezra's hand drifted unconsciously to the rifle hanging on the wall, a relic from the cabin's past owners. As if in response, a splintering crack rent the air. The sound of claws or talons or God knew what scrabbling against the back door. We were moving before conscious thought could catch up, Ezra ripping the rifle from its brackets while I frantically scanned for anything that could serve as a weapon. My hand closed around the handle of a cast-iron skillet just as a shape darkened the window by the door. In the guttering light of the lantern, I could only make out an impression of bulk, of shaggy fur and a flash of teeth that seemed too large, too numerous to belong to any natural creature. Ezra brought the rifle up to his shoulder, the muzzle trembling as he sighted at the door. "I don't know what the fuck you are," he gritted out through clenched teeth, "but you picked the wrong cabin to mess with." As if in answer, the thing outside let loose another bone-shaking roar, slamming against the door with enough force to splinter the thick oak. In the fractured moonlight spilling through the cracks, I caught a glimpse of a massive taloned paw. The claws wickedly curved and stained a rusting brown that could only be old blood. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Ezra's finger tightened on the trigger, the sharp report of the rifle like a thunderclap in the close confines of the cabin. The thing howled, an ear-splitting shriek of pain and fury, but the thudding didn't cease. If anything, it redoubled, the doorframe starting to buckle under the onslaught. Ezra cursed, fumbling to reload as I brandished my makeshift weapon with shaking hands. It was becoming horribly clear that we were outmatched here, hopelessly out of our depth against a foe that defied the very laws of nature. Just as I was bracing myself for the inevitable, for the moment when those claws would tear through our feeble barricade like tissue paper, the attack abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the cacophony that had preceded it. Ezra and I stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as we strained our ears for any hint of our assailant. Long, tense minutes ticked by, marked only by the ragged sawing of our breath and the rapid thud of our heartbeats. When the quiet remained unbroken, Ezra lowered the rifle fractionally, turning to me with a shell-shocked expression. "Is it?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak past the fear still clogging my throat. Every instinct was screaming that this was far from over, that the thing out there was just biding its time, waiting for us to let our guard down. A glimmer of movement beyond the window snapped my head around, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment I could make out nothing in the darkness. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom of the forest, a massive hunched shape lumbering into the clearing surrounding the cabin. My breath caught in my chest as the creature straightened to its full height, easily topping 7 feet. In the watery moonlight I could make out more details I wished with all my being I could forget. The thing was shaped like a man, but its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, legs too short, the torso bulging with slabs of muscle that strained against the shaggy pelt. Its face was a horror, a twisted amalgam of human and animal features. A blunt muzzle projected over a lipless mouth bristling with jagged teeth, each one as long as my thumb. But worst of all were the eyes, a sickly intelligent yellow that glowed with a feral, all-too-aware light. For a heart-stopping moment those eyes met mine through the shattered window, and I swear I saw something like dark amusement flicker in their depths, a cruel recognition of the terror it had inspired. Then, with a fluid grace belying its bulk, the creature turned and melted back into the forest, the darkness swallowing it up like it had never been. In the ringing silence that followed, Ezra and I could only stare at each other, the rifle hanging forgotten in his numb fingers. There was no doubt, no rationalization that could explain away what we had just witnessed. We had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of... In the ringing silence that followed, Ezra and I could only stare at each other, the rifle hanging forgotten in his numb fingers. There was no doubt, no rationalization that could explain away what we had just witnessed. We had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of humanity's most primal nightmares, and it had marked us as its prey. "We need to get out of here," Ezra croaked, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive quiet. "Now, before that thing comes back." I nodded jerkily, my mind already racing ahead to the logistics of our escape. The truck was our only lifeline, our sole means of getting out of these god-forsaken woods and back to the safety of civilization. But to reach it, we'd have to venture out into the night, into the domain of the creature that had nearly shattered our sanity with a single glance. "We can't go now," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "Not in the dark. We wouldn't make it 10 feet before that thing was on us." Ezra opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips as the reality of our situation sank in. Out there we were vulnerable, easy pickings for a predator that had already demonstrated its unnatural cunning and strength. In here, at least we had the illusion of shelter, the comforting solidity of walls and locked doors between us and the nightmare-made flesh. "At first light, then," he said grimly. "We pack only what we need and we make a run for it. Don't stop for anything." The hours until dawn were the longest of my life. Ezra and I took turns on watch, the rifle clutched white-knuckled in shaking hands as we peered into the void beyond the shattered window. The darkness pressed in like a living thing, every rustle of leaves, every sigh of the wind setting our nerves strumming like live wires. There was no sign of the creature, no hint of glowing eyes or shaggy bulk moving among the trees. But that almost made it worse. The thing was out there, biding its time, playing with us like a cat toying with cornered mice. For an insane moment, I almost wished it would attack again, anything to break the suffocating tension. When the first pale fingers of dawn began to creep across the sky, it felt like a benediction, a stay of execution. Hardly daring to breathe, Ezra and I gathered our meager supplies, every sense straining for the slightest hint of our tormentor's return. But the woods remained silent, still, mocking our terror with their placid serenity. It wasn't until we had the cabin door open, the truck keys clutched in Ezra's white-knuckled grip, that the facade shattered. A roar split the morning air, a sound of such fury and malevolence that it knocked the breath from my lungs. Ezra's head whipped towards the tree line, his eyes going wide with horror. I followed his gaze just in time to see the creature burst from the underbrush, its massive form hurtling towards us with terrifying speed. "Run!" Ezra screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Run!" We sprinted for the truck, hurling ourselves into the cab just as the creature reached the edge of the clearing. I caught a glimpse of its face, twisted with a rage that was all too human, before Ezra slammed the truck into gear and we were off, wheels spinning in the loose dirt. In the rearview mirror, I watched as the creature gave chase, its powerful legs eating up the ground in great loping strides. For one heart-stopping moment, I was certain it would catch us, that those wicked claws would hook into the tailgate and drag us back into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. But then we hit the main road and Ezra floored it, the truck's engine roaring as we sped away from that place of horror. I risked one last glance back, just in time to see the creature skid to a halt at the tree line. It stood there for a long moment, its chest heaving, those hellish yellow eyes boring into mine with an intensity that promised this was far from over. Then, with a final vengeful howl, it turned and vanished back into the forest depths that had spawned it. The drive back to civilization was a blur, a numb haze of adrenaline and disbelief. Ezra and I barely spoke, each lost in the impossible memories of what we had witnessed. It wasn't until we stumbled into the ranger station, babbling some half-coherent story about a bear attack, that the enormity of it all came crashing down. The rangers were dubious, their eyes flickering skeptically over our wild-eyed, haunted expressions. But they couldn't deny the claw marks gouged into the truck's bodywork, or the blood, not ours, we knew, that stained the windows. In the end, they chalked it up to a close encounter with a rogue grizzly, a tragic but explainable event. If only it were that simple. If only we could file away the events of that night as just another campfire story, a cautionary tale for the inexperienced hiker. But Ezra and I knew better. We had seen the face of something ancient and malevolent, something that defied the neat little boxes of science and reason. In the weeks and months that followed, we tried to put it behind us, to lose ourselves in the comforting banality of work and city life. But the memory lingered, an insidious poison that colored our every waking moment and lurked in the shadows of our dreams. Ezra took to the bottle, seeking solace in the numbing embrace of cheap whiskey. I threw myself into my job, working double shifts until exhaustion granted me a few precious hours of dreamless sleep. But always the creature was there, lurking on the edges of our consciousness. A flash of yellow eyes in a crowded street, a hulking shadow glimpsed from the corner of the eye. It had marked us, claimed us in some primal way we could never fully understand or escape. And as the years stretched on, the stories began to trickle in, hushed whispers of hikers vanishing without a trace, of mangled animal carcasses found deep within the forest, of eerie howls echoing through the night. Each tale was like a knife to the gut, a reminder that our nightmare was all too real. I never went back to the Adirondacks, never set foot in another wilderness without the cold grip of fear tightening around my heart. The great outdoors, once a source of solace and wonder, had become a place of dread, a realm ruled by an apex predator that walked the gossamer line between myth and reality. But even in the neon-soaked canyons of the city, I can't escape the feeling that it's out there, watching, waiting. That one day, whether by chance or design, I'll round a corner and find myself staring into those pitiless yellow eyes once more. Because in the end, there are some horrors that can never be outrun. Some scars that etch themselves onto the very soul. The wilderness may have taken everything else from me, my peace of mind, my sense of the world as a rational, orderly place, but it also gave me a terrible gift, a knowledge that can never be unlearned. Out there in the vast, untamed reaches of the world, monsters are real, and God help any man unfortunate enough to cross their path. I know this story probably sounds false, but hear me out. If you've ever been to Crater Lake National Park in southern Oregon, you've probably come across some strange UFO-esque type things. Maybe you've heard of Bigfoot. Maybe you've heard of strange lights and UFOs. The October rain hammered against the windows of the ranger station with a persistence that matched my frustration. I'd been working alongside Tom Mitchell for nearly 3 years, ever since I transferred to the Crater Lake District, and I'd never seen a man carry such weight in his silence. Sure, we all had our stories, encounters with wildlife, close calls on the trails, the occasional tourist who wandered off path and needed rescuing, but Tom's silence was different. It was the kind of quiet that sits heavy in your chest, that makes you feel like you're standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The park itself seemed designed for secrets. Crater Lake sits atop Mount Mazama, part of the Cascade Range, formed nearly 8,000 years ago when the mountain collapsed during a massive volcanic eruption. The lake is 1,949 feet deep at its deepest point, making it the deepest lake in the United States. When you stand at the rim on a clear day, looking down at those impossibly blue waters, you understand why the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahoo skin tribes regarded it as a site of power and danger, believing it served as a gateway between Earth and the underworld. But it wasn't just the indigenous legends that gave me pause. The area has been a hotspot for reported paranormal activity. UFO sightings, mysterious disappearances, strange lights, and yes, Bigfoot encounters. Most rangers learn to laugh off the tourist reports, the blurry photos, the breathless accounts of something large and hairy disappearing into the tree line. It comes with the territory. Tom never laughed. I first noticed it during my second week on the job. We were patrolling the North Rim Drive, checking on the condition of the trails after an early snowfall. The conversation had turned, as it often did among park staff, to the more unusual visitor reports we'd fielded that summer. "Remember that family from Portland, who swore they saw lights dancing over the lake?" I'd said, trying to lighten the mood. Dad was convinced it was aliens. Kids were terrified. My partner from the previous district would have chuckled, maybe shared his own story about conspiracy theorists and amateur cryptozoologists. Tom just tightened his grip on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. "You ever see anything out here you couldn't explain?" I asked. He turned to look at me then, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not annoyance or dismissal, but something closer to fear. "Best to keep your eyes on the trail," he'd said finally. "This place has a way of showing you things that aren't meant to be seen." That was the first of many conversations that ended before they really began. Over the months that followed, I learned to read the signs. When reports came in about strange sounds echoing from the forests around the park's 90 miles of trails, Tom would volunteer to investigate alone. When hikers mentioned feeling watched while camping near the remote backcountry sites, he'd take those calls too. And he'd always come back quiet, more withdrawn than before. The thing about Crater Lake that most visitors don't understand is its sheer isolation. Due to its short open season, the park averages just over 500,000 visitors every year, with most coming between July and September. But for the rest of the year, especially during the harsh winters when snow falls more often here than at any other long-term weather station in Oregon, the park becomes something altogether different. The tourist crowds disappear, the comfortable daylight hours shrink, and you're left with nothing but miles of trails and unmatched views, and whatever else might be moving through those ancient forests. Tom had been working the park for 15 years when I arrived, longer than any other ranger in the district. He knew every trail, every overlook, every hidden corner of the Caldera Rim. He could navigate the backcountry in conditions that would leave newer rangers hopelessly lost. But there was something about the night shifts that changed him. He never complained about pulling overnight patrol duty, never tried to trade shifts like the rest of us did. He seemed almost compelled to take them. "Someone needs to keep an eye on things when the sun goes down," he'd say when pressed about it.
That's when the park shows its true nature.
I began to suspect that Tom's dedication to night patrol wasn't about duty or even preference. It was about something he'd seen, something that had marked him in a way that left him feeling responsible for standing watch. The other rangers had their theories. Post-traumatic stress from a rescue gone wrong, maybe. Or just the occupational hazard of spending too much time alone in the wilderness. But I'd worked with enough people over the years to recognize the difference between general anxiety and specific fear. Tom was afraid of something particular. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in late September. We'd just finished processing a report from a group of backpackers who claimed they'd heard something large moving through the forest near their campsite at Mazama Village. The description was typical: heavy footsteps, branches breaking, an overwhelming sense of being observed by something that didn't belong. Tom had taken their statement with his usual professional detachment, but I noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he wrote. After the backpackers left, I found him standing at the window, staring out at the parking lot where the first snow of the season was beginning to accumulate. "Tom," I said carefully, "how long has it been since you've taken any time off?" He didn't turn around. Time off for what? Rest, recovery, perspective. I moved to stand beside him. "You've been carrying something heavy for a while now. Maybe it's time to share the load." For a moment I thought he might open up. His shoulders sagged, and I heard him draw a long, shaky breath. But then he straightened, and the familiar mask of professional composure slipped back into place. "There's nothing to share," he said. "Just a job that needs doing." But as he walked away, I heard him mutter something under his breath that stopped me cold. 21 years this month. 21 years of wondering if it's still out there. That night, as I lay in my quarters listening to the wind howl across the Caldera Rim, I made a decision. Whatever Tom had encountered during his years at Crater Lake, whatever had left him standing perpetual guard against the darkness, I was going to find out. Not because I didn't trust his judgment, but because I'd seen what carrying that kind of secret alone could do to a person. And because, if I was being honest with myself, I was starting to hear things in the night that shouldn't have been there. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days after that conversation, we received a call about a missing hiker on the Pacific Crest Trail, somewhere between the Lightning Spring Trailhead and the North Junction. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. October in the Cascades can turn from crisp autumn to full winter in a matter of hours, and we had maybe 6 hours of searchable daylight left. Tom volunteered immediately, as I knew he would. But this time, I insisted on partnering with him. I know those trails as well as anyone, I argued when he tried to dissuade me. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, especially with visibility dropping. He looked like he wanted to argue further, but protocol was on my side. We geared up in silence, checking our radios, headlamps, emergency supplies. The missing hiker was experienced outdoorsman from Eugene, someone who knew the terrain and understood the risks. That made his disappearance even more concerning. As we drove toward the trailhead, I tried to draw Tom into conversation about the search pattern we'd use, the likely places someone might take shelter if they were injured or disoriented. He responded with professional efficiency, but I could feel his tension building as we climbed higher into the park's backcountry. Forests of mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir predominated near the Caldera Rim, where twisted whitebark pines testified to the harshness of the long winter. The trees seemed to close in around us as we followed the trail, their branches heavy with fresh snow that muffled our footsteps and created an eerie cathedral silence. We'd been searching for about 3 hours when we found our first real clue. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch about 50 yards off the main trail. Tom examined it carefully, then looked around with a kind of focused attention that suggested he was seeing more than just trees and undergrowth. "He went this way," Tom said, pointing deeper into the forest. "But not by choice." "What do you mean?" Tom was already moving, following some trail I couldn't see. The way the fabric tore, the angle of the branch. Someone or something dragged him off the path. We followed Tom's lead through increasingly dense forest, calling the hiker's name and listening for any response. The snow was falling harder now, and I realized we were rapidly approaching the point where we'd need to call off the search until morning. That's when we found him. He was alive, conscious, and sitting with his back against a large Douglas fir about a quarter mile from where we'd found the fabric. But something was very wrong. As we approached, I could see that his eyes were wide with a kind of primal terror I'd never witnessed before. He was shivering uncontrollably, and not just from the cold. "Sir, are you injured?" I called out as we reached him. He turned toward my voice, but his gaze seemed to pass right through me. "It's still out there," he whispered. "It's been watching me, waiting." Tom and I exchanged glances. Hypothermia could cause disorientation, hallucinations even, but something about the man's tone suggested he wasn't suffering from exposure-induced delusions. "What's been watching you?" Tom asked, and I was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "I don't know what to call it," the hiker said. "I've been hiking these mountains for 20 years. I know what lives here. Bears, mountain lions, deer. This wasn't any of those things." He looked directly at Tom then, and I saw recognition flicker between them. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He knelt beside the hiker, checking for signs of injury while I radioed for a medical evacuation. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the tree line around us. As we waited for the helicopter, the hiker told us what had happened. He'd been following the PCT south from Lightning Spring when he heard something paralleling his movement through the forest. At first he'd assumed it was a bear or elk, but the sounds were wrong, too deliberate, too intelligent. "It knew I was aware of it," he said, "so it started getting closer. I could smell it, this awful musky odor like wet fur and decay. And the breathing, God, the breathing was like nothing I've ever heard." "What did you see?" I asked. The hiker's eyes filled with tears. It came out of the trees about 50 yards ahead of me, stood right in the middle of the trail like it owned the place. Had to be 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, but the face... He shuddered. The face was almost human. Almost. But the eyes were wrong. Too intelligent. Too aware. And when it looked at me, I felt like it was seeing straight through to my soul. I glanced at Tom and saw that his face had gone completely pale. It just stared at me for maybe 30 seconds. The hiker continued. Then it made this sound. Part growl, part something else. And it gestured, pointed off into the forest like it wanted me to follow. When I didn't move, it started walking toward me. "That's when you left the trail?" Tom asked. I ran, crashed through the undergrowth like a panicked animal. Must have caught my jacket on that branch. When I finally stopped running, I was completely lost. I've been sitting here for hours, too scared to move because I can hear it out there, moving through the trees, circling. The helicopter arrived just as darkness was settling over the forest. As the medical team prepared the hiker for transport, he grabbed Tom's arm. "You believe me, don't you?" he pleaded. "You've seen it." Tom looked into the man's eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "I've seen it." After the helicopter disappeared into the night, Tom and I made our way back to the vehicle in silence. But as we reached the trailhead, I stopped. "Tom," I said, "we need to talk." He paused with his hand on the truck door. In the pale light from our headlamps, I could see that he was struggling with something. "Not here," he said finally. "Not in the open." We drove back to the ranger station without speaking. But as we pulled into the parking lot, Tom made a decision that changed everything between us. "Come to my place," he said. "If you really want to know what's out there, if you really want to understand why I take the night shifts, then come to my place. But once I tell you, you can't unknow it, and you can't pretend it's not real." I followed his truck through the winding roads that led to the small community where many of the park staff lived. Tom's house was a modest cabin tucked into a grove of old-growth fir trees, the kind of place that might seem cozy under normal circumstances. But as we walked to the front door, I noticed the heavy-duty locks, the reinforced window frames, the motion sensor lights that illuminated every approach to the building. Inside, Tom poured 2 glasses of whiskey and gestured for me to sit at his kitchen table. For several minutes he just stared into his glass, gathering courage for whatever he was about to tell me. "That hiker," he said finally. "His description, it matches what I saw in the year 2000, down to the smallest detail." "You're talking about Bigfoot," I said carefully. Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "If only it were that simple. If it were just some unknown primate, some relic species that managed to survive in these mountains, I could handle that. But what I encountered that night," he took a long drink. "What I encountered wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely. Tell me what happened." Tom set down his glass and looked directly at me. I'd been working night patrol alone, during a shift that should have been routine. It was late October, a lot like tonight actually. Cold snow starting to fall. I was checking the remote campgrounds, making sure everything was secure for the winter closure. He paused, and I could see him slipping back into that night, reliving details he'd probably tried to forget. "That's when I saw it," he continued, "and when it saw me, and when my life changed forever." Tom stood up abruptly and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond the motion sensor lights. The whiskey had loosened something in him, but I could see that even 21 years later, talking about that night required every ounce of courage he possessed. "October 15th, 2000, he said without turning around. "I remember the date because it's burned into my memory like a brand. I was 26 years old, still new enough to the job that I wanted to prove myself. When the opportunity came up to work a solo night patrol, I jumped at it." He returned to the table but remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "The assignment was simple enough. Drive the service roads through the backcountry areas, check on the remote facilities, make sure no one was camping illegally before the winter closure. Most of it was routine, the kind of work you can do on autopilot. But there was one stop that always made me uneasy." "Which one?" "The old research station near Lau Rock. It's about 2 miles off the main Rim Drive, accessible only by a narrow service road that winds through some of the densest forest in the park. The station had been abandoned for years, but we still had to check it periodically for signs of vandalism or unauthorized entry." Tom moved to a drawer and pulled out a detailed topographic map of the park, spreading it across the table. He pointed to an area on the north side of the caldera, where the contour lines clustered together to indicate steep terrain. "Here," he said. "The road ends at a small clearing where the research station sits. Forests of mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir predominate near the caldera rim, and they're thick enough that even during the day very little sunlight reaches the ground. At night, with just your headlights and flashlight, it feels like you're driving into a cave." He traced the route with his finger, and I could see his hand trembling slightly. I'd made the drive dozens of times before, but that night felt different from the moment I turned off the main road. The temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath even inside the truck. And there was this smell. What kind of smell? Like something had died and been left to rot. But not just death. Something else mixed in. Something wild and musky and old. Really old. Tom sat down heavily. I figured it was just a deer or elk carcass somewhere nearby. Maybe a bear kill. So I continued toward the station. He paused to take another drink, and I noticed that his eyes kept darting toward the windows. About halfway to the station, maybe a mile from the main road, my headlights picked up something moving through the trees. At first I thought it was a bear. The size was right, and the way it was moving, upright, but with that characteristic rolling gait. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Wrong how? Bears don't walk perfectly upright for extended periods. They'll rear up to get a better look at something, maybe take a few steps on their hind legs, but then they drop back down. This thing was striding through the forest like a person, a very large person. Tom stood again and began pacing, the nervous energy too much for him to contain. I stopped the truck and grabbed my spotlight, one of those high-powered units we use for search and rescue. When I aimed it into the trees, I caught a glimpse of dark fur and massive shoulders disappearing behind a cluster of old-growth firs. But I also saw something else, something that made my blood run cold. What? Intelligence. Purpose. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just wandering through the forest. It was moving with the kind of deliberate intent that you only see in higher predators. And it was moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with my truck. The implications of that statement settled over me like a chill. If something was intentionally following the service road, matching the speed of a vehicle, it suggested a level of cognitive ability that was deeply unsettling. I should have turned around right then, Tom continued. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, but I was young and stupid, and convinced that I was dealing with a bear that would eventually lose interest and wander off. So I continued toward the research station. He moved to another window, checking the darkness beyond as if he expected something to be watching us. The service road curved sharply about a quarter mile before the station, following the natural contours of the ridge. As I came around that curve, my headlights swept across the clearing where the research station sits, and there it was. Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, standing directly in front of the building, not hiding in the shadows, not crouched behind cover, standing in the open like it owned the place, like it had been waiting for me. How big was it? Massive. Had to be 8, maybe 9 feet tall, with shoulders that were easily 3 feet across. Covered in dark hair, not fur like a bear, but hair. Coarse, thick hair that hung in matted clumps. But it was the posture that got to me. Completely upright, arms hanging at its sides, head tilted slightly as if it was studying my truck. Tom returned to his chair but couldn't seem to sit still. His description matched the hiker's account almost perfectly, down to the smallest details. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine running, headlights illuminating this thing like it was performing on a stage, and it just stared back at me. Didn't move, didn't react to the lights or the sound of the engine, just watched. Could you see its face? Tom closed his eyes and I could see him forcing himself to remember details he'd probably spent years trying to forget. That's when everything changed, he said. I grabbed my flashlight and added its beam to the headlights, trying to get a better look. And when that extra light hit its face, he opened his eyes and looked directly at me. It was humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. The basic structure was there. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but the proportions were all off. The brow ridge was massive, protruding like a shelf over eyes that were too large and too dark. The nose was flattened, more like a gorilla's than a human's. And the mouth. Tom shuddered. When it saw the flashlight beam hit its face, it opened its mouth. Not in aggression or threat, but almost like it was smiling, showing me teeth that were too long, too sharp, too numerous. And that's when I saw the intelligence behind those eyes.
What do you mean?
It wasn't just looking at me, it was studying me, evaluating me, making some kind of assessment about who I was and what I represented. And in that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that I was not dealing with an animal. I was facing something that possessed a level of consciousness and cognitive ability that shouldn't exist. The room fell silent except for the sound of wind in the trees outside. I found myself thinking about the Native American legends that warned of dangerous beings living within the depths of Crater Lake, creatures that served as guardians between this world and something far more sinister. "How long did you stare at each other?" I asked. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few more seconds. Then, without any warning, it took a step toward my truck. And that's when I finally understood the true magnitude of what I was dealing with. Tom's voice became even quieter, forcing me to lean forward to hear him. Each step it took covered an enormous amount of ground. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with a stride length that defied belief. And as it approached, I could see more details that my mind really didn't want to process. Such as, the arms were too long, hanging down past where its knees should have been. The hands. Tom paused and took a shaky breath. The hands were almost human, but larger and tipped with claws that caught the light from my headlights. Dark claws, maybe 4 inches long, that looked like they could tear through steel. "What did you do?" "What any sane person would do. I threw the truck in reverse and got the hell out of there. But as I was backing up, trying to turn around in that narrow clearing, I made the mistake of looking in my side mirror." Tom stood and walked to the window again, as if the act of looking outside could somehow verify that we were safe in the present moment. It had followed me, not running, not charging, just walking with that same measured pace. And it was smiling again, like it was enjoying my fear, like this was all some kind of game to it. "Did it pursue you once you got turned around?" That's the strangest part. Once I got the truck pointed back toward the main road and started driving away, it just stopped. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see it chasing after me, but it had simply returned to its position in front of the research station, like a guard returning to his post. Tom came back to the table and finished his whiskey in one gulp. I drove straight back to the ranger station and sat in the parking lot for about an hour, trying to process what I just experienced, trying to convince myself that it had been a bear, or a trick of the light, or anything other than what I knew it actually was. But you couldn't convince yourself. No, because of what happened next, what it did to me. Tom looked directly into my eyes, and I saw a depth of exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. When that thing looked at me, when our eyes met across that clearing, it wasn't just seeing me, it was seeing into me, reading me, learning something about who I am at the most fundamental level. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for the rest of my life. I felt connected to it. Not in some mystical or supernatural way, but like it marked me, like it decided that I was someone it needed to keep track of. And ever since that night, I felt its presence in these mountains. Watching, waiting, making sure I remember our encounter." The implications of Tom's statement sent a chill down my spine. If he was right, if something that intelligent and powerful had taken a personal interest in him, then his years of night patrol work took on an entirely different meaning. "Tom," I said carefully, "are you saying you think it's still out there, still watching you?" He nodded slowly. "I know it is, because I've seen it again. Not up close like that first time, but glimpses, shadows moving through the forest during my patrols, shapes that disappear when I try to focus on them, and sometimes," he paused, "sometimes I hear it calling." Calling? Not words, not language as we understand it, but sounds that seem to carry meaning, like it's trying to communicate, like it wants me to come back to that clearing, back to where we first met. Tom's confession hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss his account as the product of stress, isolation, and 21 years of psychological pressure. But the professional part of my mind, the part trained to evaluate evidence and assess credible threats, couldn't ignore the consistency of his story with other reports we'd received over the years. "What do you think it wants?" I asked. Tom smiled sadly. "I think it wants me to understand that these mountains belong to it, that we're just temporary visitors in its domain. And I think," he hesitated, "I think it's been waiting for the right moment to deliver that message more clearly." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the forest outside. A low resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tom and I both froze, listening as the sound repeated twice more before fading into the night. "That," Tom whispered. is why I take the night shifts. The sound outside Tom's cabin that night changed everything between us. Not just because it validated his account of the encounter, but because it meant that whatever he'd faced in the year 2000 was still active, still present, and still paying attention to human activity in the park. The next morning I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just days earlier. I requested access to all incident reports filed at Crater Lake National Park over the past 25 years, particularly those involving unexplained sightings, missing persons, and unusual animal encounters. If Tom's experience was part of a larger pattern, I needed to understand the scope of what we were dealing with. What I found in the archives was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Crater Lake had indeed been a hotspot for unexplained phenomena for decades. The reports followed certain patterns that, once I began looking for them, were impossible to ignore. Sightings clustered around the remote areas of the park, particularly the backcountry regions, accessible only by service roads or hiking trails. They occurred most frequently during the shoulder seasons, late fall and early spring, when tourist traffic was minimal and the weather conditions were harsh. But most significantly, they showed a marked increase in both frequency and detail starting in the year of Tom's encounter. I spread the reports across my desk and began creating a timeline. 3 weeks after Tom's initial sighting, a backpacking group reported being stalked by something large while camping near the Pacific Crest Trail junction. 2 months later, a maintenance worker described hearing human-like vocalizations coming from the forest while repairing trail markers in the same general area where Tom had his encounter. The pattern continued year after year. Hikers reporting the feeling of being watched. Campers describing heavy footsteps circling their sites during the night. Park employees finding unusually large footprints in soft soil, always in areas where Tom conducted his regular patrols. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. Hidden among the routine incident reports was a series of internal memos exchanged between park supervisors and regional wildlife biologists, starting in The correspondence revealed that park management had been quietly investigating reports of an unknown large mammal for years, but had deliberately kept the investigation low profile to avoid media attention and potential panic among visitors. The memos included detailed photographs of tracks, hair samples, and even audio recordings of vocalizations that didn't match any known species in the region. Wildlife experts from Oregon State University had been consulted confidentially, and their conclusions were unambiguous. The evidence suggested the presence of an unknown primate species significantly larger than any documented North American fauna. More troubling were the behavioral assessments included in the files. Unlike typical wildlife encounters where animals generally avoided human contact, this creature seemed to be actively monitoring human activity in specific areas of the park. Trail cameras had captured fleeting images of a large bipedal figure, always at the periphery of the frame, always seemingly aware of the camera's presence. It demonstrates what can only be described as surveillance behavior, read one report from 2005. The subject appears to be conducting systematic observation of human activity patterns, particularly those of park staff conducting routine maintenance and patrol duties. I called Tom into my office to review the evidence. As he read through the reports and studied the photographs, I watched his face cycle through a range of emotions. Relief at finally having his experience validated, concern about the implications of what we'd discovered, and something else that took me a moment to identify: fear. Not for himself, but for what might happen if this information became public. "They've been covering it up," he said finally. "Not covering up. Managing, containing, there's a difference." Tom looked at me sharply. "Is there? These reports go back decades. How many people have encountered this thing? How many have been too scared or embarrassed to report it officially?" It was a valid question. For every incident that made it into the official files, there were probably dozens more that went unreported. The stigma associated with cryptid sightings, combined with the natural reluctance to report something that sounded impossible, meant we were likely seeing only a fraction of the actual encounters. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to a photo dated 6 months earlier. It showed a series of footprints in snow, each one measuring nearly 18 inches long and showing clear impressions of 5 distinct toes. This was taken less than a mile from where I saw it that first night. The footprints were remarkable, not just for their size, but for their clarity and the depth of impression they'd left in the snow. Whatever had made them weighed significantly more than a human being, and the stride length suggested a creature of enormous proportions. "Tom," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He looked up from the reports. "In all the years since your encounter, through all the night patrols and all the times you felt its presence, have you ever tried to make contact? Have you ever gone back to that clearing deliberately?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with whether to tell me the truth. "Yes," he said finally, "several times. And it was always there, waiting, like it knew I would come." Tom's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "The last time was about 6 months ago. I drove out to the research station around midnight. Same route as that first night. But this time, I got out of the truck. I felt my blood run cold. Tom, that was incredibly dangerous. I know, but I needed to understand what it wanted from me. 20 years of feeling watched, of knowing something was out there keeping track of my movements. I couldn't live with that uncertainty anymore." "What happened?" Tom stood and walked to the window overlooking the park's main road. A few early tourists were already arriving for the day, unaware of the conversation taking place just a few hundred yards from their peaceful nature experience. It came out of the trees the moment I stepped away from the truck. Not aggressive, not threatening, just curious. It approached to within maybe 20 feet and stopped, and we looked at each other again, just like that first night. Could you see it clearly? Clearer than I wanted to. It had aged. There were streaks of gray in the dark hair, and the face showed lines that hadn't been there before. But the eyes, Tom turned back to me. The eyes were exactly the same. Still intelligent, still aware, still somehow sad. Sad? That's the only way I can describe it. Like it was lonely. Like it had been waiting all these years for someone to acknowledge its existence, to treat it as something more than a monster hiding in the woods. Tom returned to his chair and pulled out a small digital recorder. "I recorded our encounter," he said, setting the device on my desk. "I'm not sure why. Maybe I thought no one would believe me without proof. Maybe I just wanted to document what might be the most significant zoological discovery in modern history." He pressed play, and the recording began with the ambient sounds of the forest at night. Wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft hum of insects. But after about 30 seconds, a new sound emerged. A series of low, resonant vocalizations that seemed to carry emotional weight far beyond simple animal communication. The sounds were hauntingly melodic, rising and falling in patterns that suggested language or at least complex emotional expression. But what struck me most was the way they seemed to echo in the recording, as if the creature possessed a vocal range and resonance that exceeded normal biological parameters. "It was trying to communicate," Tom said as the recording continued. "Not just making noise or trying to intimidate me. It was actually attempting some form of dialogue." "Did you respond?" "I tried. I spoke to it. Quietly, calmly, the way you might approach any wild animal. And it listened. Really listened. When I stopped talking, it would respond with more vocalizations. We went back and forth like that for maybe 10 minutes. The recording captured exactly what Tom described. An exchange between human and something else that demonstrated unmistakable intelligence and intent. Whatever this creature was, it possessed cognitive abilities that placed it far beyond any known animal species. "How did the encounter end?" I asked. "It just walked away, turned around and disappeared back into the forest. But before it left, it did something that I'll never forget." Tom paused the recording and looked directly at me. It pointed, deliberately, clearly, unmistakably pointed toward the deeper forest, like it was inviting me to follow, like it wanted to show me something. "Did you follow?" "No. I'm not that brave or that stupid, but I've thought about it every day since. What if it was trying to share something important? What if there are others like it out there? What if this whole area is home to a population of these creatures that we've never acknowledged or studied?" The implications of Tom's questions were staggering. If even one creature like this existed, it would revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and North American ecosystems. If there were multiple individuals, if there was an entire population living undiscovered in the remote corners of Crater Lake National Park, then we were looking at potentially the most significant biological discovery in human history. But we were also looking at a management nightmare of unprecedented proportions. "Tom," I said, I think we need to involve someone with more expertise than either of us possesses. Someone who can help us understand what we're dealing with and how to proceed responsibly. You mean go public? I mean proceed carefully. Crater Lake is already known for mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. If word gets out that there's credible evidence of an unknown primate species living in the park, we'll have every cryptozoologist, thrill seeker, and media outlet in the country descending on us. That could be dangerous for both the creatures and the public. Tom nodded slowly. So what do you suggest? Before I could answer, my radio crackled to life with an urgent message from Park Dispatch. Another hiker had gone missing, this time in the exact area where Tom had been conducting his encounters with the creature. The search and rescue operation was being organized, and all available personnel were being called in to assist. As Tom and I gathered our gear and prepared to head out, I couldn't shake the feeling that this disappearance wasn't random. If the creature had been trying to communicate with Tom, if it had been attempting to establish some form of contact with human beings, then maybe its patience had finally run out. Maybe it had decided to take a more direct approach. The missing hiker was Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist from Portland State University who had been studying behavioral patterns in Oregon's wildlife populations. According to her research permit, she'd been conducting observational studies in the remote backcountry areas of Crater Lake for the past 3 weeks. Her last known location was the trail junction near Lau Rock, less than a mile from the research station where Tom had first encountered the creature. This was not a coincidence. As we organized the search teams, Tom pulled me aside with a grim expression. She was looking for it, he said quietly. Dr. Chen? She contacted me about 2 months ago, asking questions about unusual wildlife sightings in the park. I thought she was just another academic chasing cryptid stories, so I didn't tell her anything. You think she found evidence of the creature on her own? I think she found something that led her to the right area, and I think she got too close. The implications were chilling. If a trained primatologist had been studying the creature, and had subsequently disappeared, it suggested either that her research had taken her into dangerous territory, or that the creature had decided to actively intervene in human attempts to study it. We deployed 3 search teams across the area where Dr. Chen had last been seen. Tom and I took the route that led toward the abandoned research station, following the same path he'd driven that night in 2000. But this time we were on foot, moving through terrain that seemed somehow more hostile and unwelcoming than I'd ever experienced it. The forests of mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir closed in around us as we followed the trail, their branches heavy with new snow that muffled sound and created an oppressive sense of isolation. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound suggested something large moving just beyond our line of sight. We'd been searching for about 2 hours when we found Dr. Chen's backpack. It was sitting in the middle of a small clearing, positioned so deliberately that it was clearly meant to be found. The pack hadn't been torn or damaged. It had been carefully placed, almost like an offering or a message. Tom approached it cautiously while I maintained watch on the tree line around us. Her research notes are still here, Tom said, rifling through the contents. Camera, recording equipment, sample containers. Everything you'd expect a field researcher to carry. Any indication of what she found. Tom pulled out a waterproof notebook and began reading Dr. Chen's most recent entries. His face grew increasingly grave as he progressed through her observations. Listen to this, he said. Day 18 of observation. Subject demonstrates consistent territorial behavior around abandoned research facility. Vocalizations recorded indicate sophisticated communication system beyond current primate classification. Evidence suggests possible family group structure with multiple individuals. Multiple individuals. The creature Tom had been encountering for 21 years wasn't a solitary anomaly. There was a population of them living in the remote corners of Crater Lake National Park. There's more, Tom continued. Day 20. Attempted direct observation from concealed position near research station. Subject aware of surveillance but tolerated presence. Clear evidence of tool use and environmental modification. Intelligence assessment comparable to great apes, possibly higher. Recommendation: immediate contact with cryptozoological research community. Dr. Chen had been planning to go public with her findings. She documented evidence of an unknown primate species and was preparing to share her research with the academic community. And then she disappeared. Tom, I said slowly, where exactly are we right now? He looked around, getting his bearings from the surrounding landmarks. About a quarter mile from the research station. We're on the same route I took that first night. And you said the creature always seemed to know when you were coming. Like it was monitoring your approach. Tom nodded, understanding immediately where my thoughts were leading. You think it knows we're here now? Before I could answer, we heard it. A low, resonant call echoing through the forest from somewhere ahead of us. The same sound Tom had recorded during his encounter 6 months earlier, but louder, more insistent, somehow more urgent. It's calling to us, Tom said, just like Dr. Chen described in her notes. We had a choice to make. We could radio for backup, retreat to safety, and wait for reinforcements before proceeding. Or we could follow the sound toward what was almost certainly a direct encounter with the creature that had been shaping Tom's life for the past 2 decades. We need to find Dr. Chen, I said. Tom checked his radio and service weapon, then looked toward the direction the call had come from. Together? Together. We moved through the forest with the careful deliberation of soldiers entering hostile territory. Every step was measured, every sound evaluated for potential threat. The calls continued to echo around us, seeming to come from multiple directions, suggesting that we were being guided along a specific route. After 20 minutes of careful progress, we emerged into the clearing where the research station sat. And there, standing exactly where Tom had first seen it 21 years earlier, was the creature. But this time, it wasn't alone. 2 smaller figures flanked it on either side, still massive by human standards but clearly younger, possibly offspring. And sitting on the ground between them, very much alive but obviously shaken, was Dr. Chen. The adult creature, the same one Tom had been encountering all these years, stepped forward slightly when it saw us emerge from the tree line. But instead of the aggressive posture we might have expected, it raised one massive hand in what could only be interpreted as a greeting. Dr. Chen, I called out carefully. Are you injured? She looked toward us with wide eyes but shook her head. I'm okay, she called back, but I think they want to talk. The adult creature gestured toward Dr. Chen, then toward us, then toward itself. The meaning was unmistakable. It wanted to facilitate some form of communication between the human researchers and its family group. Tom stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. You remember me? He said to the creature. The massive head nodded once, distinctly and deliberately. You've been watching me all these years, waiting for me to come back. Another nod. And now you've brought Dr. Chen here because she understands what you are, what you represent. The creature gestured toward Dr. Chen again, then toward the abandoned research station behind it. Following its indication, I noticed for the first time that the building had been modified. Windows that had been boarded up for years were now clear, and there were signs of recent habitation around the structure. They've been living here, Dr. Chen said, her voice filled with wonder and professional excitement, using the research station as shelter. They've been here for decades, possibly longer. A stable family group that's managed to remain hidden from human detection. Until now, Tom said. The adult creature made a series of vocalizations, complex, melodic sounds that carried emotional undertones of sadness and resignation. It gestured toward the forest around us, then toward the 3 humans in the clearing. Dr. Chen translated softly. I think it's saying that hiding is no longer possible, that too many people are coming into their territory, that they need to find a new arrangement with our species. The implications of what we were witnessing began to sink in. This wasn't just a cryptozoological discovery. It was first contact with what was essentially a separate intelligent species that had been sharing our world in secret for generations. These creatures possessed language, tool use, family structures, and territorial awareness. They had been observing human activity for decades, learning our patterns, understanding our behaviors. And now they were ready to make themselves known. What do they want from us? I asked. The adult creature gestured toward Tom specifically, then toward itself, then toward the research station. The meaning was clear. It wanted Tom to approach, to engage in direct communication. Tom looked at me, and I saw 21 years of curiosity, fear, and wonder warring in his expression. This is what it's been waiting for, he said. All this time, all these encounters, it was building up to this moment. He walked slowly across the clearing, stopping about 10 feet from the creature. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The park ranger who had dedicated his life to protecting this place, and the intelligent being that had been its secret guardian for generations. Then the creature did something that changed everything. It reached behind itself and produced an object that it held out toward Tom. A carved piece of wood, intricate and beautiful, clearly the product of sophisticated tool use and artistic ability. Tom accepted the gift with obvious reverence, examining the craftsmanship with professional appreciation. "It's beautiful," he said. "Thank you." The creature nodded once more, then gestured toward the forest beyond the clearing. The message was unmistakable. It was time for them to leave, to find a new home away from the increasing human presence in their traditional territory. "Wait," Dr. Chen called out, rising to her feet. "Please, we need to understand. We need to document this properly. The scientific community, the government, they need to know that you exist." The adult creature looked at her for a long moment, then shook its massive head. It gestured toward the sky, toward the world beyond the forest, and made a series of vocalizations that sounded distinctly negative. "They don't want to be studied," Tom said, understanding instinctively. "They don't want to become specimens or curiosities. They just want to live in peace." The creature nodded again, then began walking toward the tree line. The two younger individuals followed, moving with the same fluid grace that had characterized their elder. But before disappearing into the forest, the adult turned back one last time. It looked directly at Tom and made a single soft vocalization that sounded unmistakably like gratitude. Then it was gone, vanishing into the ancient forest that had sheltered its kind for generations. We stood in the clearing for several minutes after they disappeared, processing what we had just experienced. Dr. Chen was frantically scribbling notes in her field journal, trying to capture every detail of the encounter. Tom was examining the carved artifact they had left behind, running his fingers over the intricate patterns with obvious emotion. "They're leaving," he said finally. "After all these years, they're finally leaving." "Where will they go?" Dr. Chen asked. Tom looked toward the deeper wilderness beyond the park boundaries, toward the vast expanses of undeveloped forest that still existed in the remote corners of the Cascade Range. "Somewhere we'll never find them. Somewhere they can continue to exist without interference from our world." As we made our way back through the forest toward the search teams, I found myself thinking about the implications of what we'd witnessed. We had documented evidence of an intelligent species that had been sharing our world in secret, creatures that possessed cognitive abilities and cultural structures that challenged our understanding of evolution and consciousness. But we also had a responsibility to honor their clearly expressed desire for privacy and autonomy. "What do we tell the search teams about Dr. Chen?" I asked Tom. "The truth," Dr. Chen answered before Tom could respond. "That I got lost. That I spent a cold night in the forest and that I was found safe and unharmed." "And your research? Your documentation of their existence?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, weighing the implications of her decision. "Some discoveries are too important to publicize," she said finally. "Some secrets are meant to be kept." That evening, as we filed our reports and briefed the search and rescue teams on Dr. Chen's successful recovery, Tom and I sat in his cabin one more time. The carved artifact sat on his kitchen table between us, tangible proof of our encounter with something extraordinary. "Do you think we made the right choice?" I asked. Tom smiled for the first time since I'd known him, not the strained expression of someone carrying a terrible secret, but the genuine smile of someone who had finally found peace. "I think we honored their wishes," he said, "and I think that's all any of us can ask for." Outside, the forest of Crater Lake National Park settled into its familiar rhythms of wind and wildlife. But somewhere in those ancient trees, a family of remarkable beings was beginning a new chapter of their existence, carrying with them the knowledge that at least a few humans were capable of respecting their right to remain hidden. Tom never worked another night shift after that encounter. He didn't need to anymore. His 21-year vigil was finally over, and the creatures he had been unconsciously protecting were safe in their anonymity. The park returned to its normal patterns of operation, and the official records would show nothing more than a routine missing person case resolved successfully. But sometimes, late at night when the moon is dark and the forest is particularly quiet, rangers still report hearing distant calls echoing through the mountains around Crater Lake. Calls that seem to carry messages of gratitude from the hidden guardians of the wilderness. acknowledging the humans who chose to keep their secrets safe. And in Tom's cabin, the carved artifact serves as a reminder that this world still holds mysteries worth protecting, and that the greatest discoveries are sometimes the ones we choose never to share.